So, happy Wednesday, everyone. Welcome to the stream. Uh, Once again, we have an excellent guest on. Today, a real luminary in the effective altruism sort of space in the community. So, her name's Dr. Michelle Hutchinson, and she's very kindly joined us today to talk a bit about her career and what we can all be doing to kind of do the most good we can. Um, the Giving What We Can page I have here is not necessarily related, although if you are interested, do click through and follow that. Um, so Michelle, thank you very much for coming on. You
So yeah,
are taking care of your baby at the moment, but that's all cool. He's going to be they're going to be a new little guest on stream. Um,
bonus guest.
Absolutely, two for the price of one. Um, so I guess I wanted to kind of start off. You've been in effective altruism since pretty kind of soon, pretty close to the start. Um, how is the well? First, before I dive into the deeper questions, what is effective altruism? What's the kind of core of the idea?
I think the basic idea is really simple, and it's that those of us lucky enough to be able to devote our resources um, to it should be helping others, and that we should be thinking carefully about how we help others, and in particular, how we can improve the lives of others as much as possible, um, rather than doing the things that seem most obvious to do.
So I think a particularly important kind of part of that point is the fact that um, we're thinking carefully about it, and that even though there might be some interventions, some charitable causes or policies or whatever that on the face of it appear very attractive, when we actually look into the evidence, it becomes clear that there can be a very large gulf between the things that seem good and the things that are very, very good. So, like the difference between uh, digging a well in a underprivileged country in the developing world, which might ostensibly seem to help them get clean water, but when the problem is more treating underlying diseases that are far, far cheaper to treat and potentially more effective than getting them clean water, it's not immediately clear that that's going to be better, but in actuality, once we study the data, it turns out that that's where we should be giving our money if our interest is in helping people in the developing world. Um,
Yeah, I think that using evidence is a really important component
mm,
of it. I think another important component is uh, some kind of impartiality of widening our moral sphere, and thinking not just about how we can help those people closest to us, but also how we can help people who might be the other side of the world, or people who have trouble advocating for themselves, which might include people who haven't actually been born yet,
mm.
since they have no way at all of advocating for themselves, and also maybe animals as well as humans.
Yeah, and I think so. The animals is something that I think intuitively a lot of people would disagree with, but and this is something that I've changed my mind on over the last decade and a half or so. Is I used to be very dismissive of the value of animals, but partially from not so much from effective altruism, but from learning neuroscience, I've become more respectful of the at least the possibility that uh, non-humans, and particularly non-humans with complex cognitive architectures and behaviors, have a morally meaningful experience.
Yeah, I don't know how to think about how counterintuitive this is, because I think, in fact, at least for most people in rich countries, it
Mm,
actually is very intuitive that pets suffer. I mean, the amount that people care about their cats and dogs and notice when they're suffering due to sickness or due to having hurt their paw or something really indicates that humans do empathize a ton with animals.
Mm.
And I don't know very much about biology at all, but my understanding is that, in particular, pigs, unlike some other farmed animals, are really quite smart, and
Yep.
so would be considered to be relevantly similar to dogs and cats by people who care a lot about them. And so I think it's not totally clear that this is a really counterintuitive stance to take. I don't know how you felt about
Mm.
cats and dogs in the past.
No, I think I had a positive stance towards them, um, but I suppose my position previously would have been that they probably have some kind of experience and probably should be protected from harm. But uh, I think now that it's not just that their behavior happens to mimic humans for kind of very base evolutionary reasons. I think there is some value uh, in more directly comparing our experiences and in at least working on the basis that they have some conscious experience beyond kind of just reflexive um, emotional behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Particularly in the UK, we have quite a strong history of treating animals well, at least our our pets. And yeah, I think it's particularly with the advent of things like meat substitutes that can actually provide you with a very pleasant, food experience without necessitating the killing of something like a pig that, as you say, is quite intelligent and capable of it seems complex sensory and social behavior. Uh, I think it's much easier these days to make that substitution, which makes the kind of moral calculus all the more compelling. Um, and that's something that's partially in Effective Altruist Project. I believe a lot of EA resources have gone into producing meat replacements and funding research in that area.
Yeah, it is a big research area within effective altruism, along with corporate campaigns to improve conditions in factory farms. Because I think that a lot of effective altruists try to take seriously is being pragmatic about what kinds of solutions are
Mm.
going to work best. And so, in the case of non-human animals, thinking through the fact that actually it's really hard for people who are used to eating meat to suddenly give up on it, and therefore thinking through how we can make it as easy a step as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's certainly something where historically in my personal experience, I had quite a big problem with the sort of animal rights movement. Uh, when I was 16, I founded a campaign group that demonstrated in favour of research in animals, arguing
I was
from.
at the panel talk that you gave there, actually.
Oh, really?
Yep,
Oh, wow. I'm glad to hear it. I hope I spoke well.
you certainly did. I remember being impressed. I remembered, yeah, how the doctor that was speaking alongside you, I felt kind of let the cause down because he clearly felt that his point was
Mm,
obvious,
yeah,
whereas I thought that you really went out of your way to properly explain, yeah, your point of view.
thank you. Was that at the Oxford Union one or the one in the?
No, it was the one in the mitre.
Oh yeah, yeah. Um, that that doctor is my supervisor now. Um,
Oh, sorry.
no, it's fine, it's fine. No, I'm sure Professor Aziz, Tipu Aziz, would agree with you that he's not necessarily the most. He, he works from the assumption that animal research is. Well, not so much he works from the assumption that, but he's very convinced by his work, and he doesn't necessarily uh, immediately grasp why some people wouldn't understand. Um, but yeah, as Neon Golden says in chat, Tipu has a thick enough skin, he can handle some bluntness. Yeah, he'll be
I
fine with
imagine that
that.
I would be similarly bad speaking on a panel about why people should vaccinate their children.
Yeah, yeah, precisely. And it's something that, well, thank you for your compliment. I think I've always been moderately decent at is trying to kind of take that other perspective and say, okay, well, obviously animal research or effective altruism or vaccinating children is a good thing, but if I didn't think it was a good thing, what would be my reasons for that, and how can I kind of attack those? So yeah, thank you very much. And back then, I got quite a lot of hassle from the anti-research sort of animal rights activists and so forth. But at the time, I was very much under the impression that they were the bulk of the animal rights community. Um, but now I have much greater appreciation for animal rights and animal welfare activists associated with effective altruism and with similar kind of mindset who take a much more pragmatic approach, balancing the excuse me both the millions of animals used a year in research worldwide versus the many billions used a year in factory farming, and also the very clear positive effects we get from using research, which, even if one is going to take a kind of deontological stance against using animals for our own ends, or a virtue ethics stance or whatever, um, I think it's irrational to not admit that it's had some very real benefits, and I think one has to make that kind of trade-off versus factory farming, where I mean, I'm not going to deny bacon is very tasty, but it's not saving me from heart disease or diabetes or anything like that.
Yeah, it does seem like kind of a different category in terms of the reasons for doing it.
Yeah. Um, so anyway, circling back around to my first actual question, um, uh, this kind of brings up the early stages of the movement, and so you were obviously in Oxford from 2006 then, because that was when I was doing all my protesting. Um, but effective altruism has, well, it's started since then. It's a relatively new movement. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so how did you kind of first get involved with it?
I did a, well, philosophy and physics first off degree, and then a philosophy master's. And during my philosophy master's, I was in the same year as Will McCaskill, and Toby Ord was in the philosophy department as well at that point. And they were in the process of discussing setting up this organization called Giving What We Can.
Mm,
And Giving What We Can is an organization that asks people to pledge to donate 10% of their income for the rest of their lives to the charity they think can most improve the lives of others, where they is the person taking the pledge, not the organization.
And
Um,
sorry, just to clarify that, it's really excellent. I've taken the pledge. I would recommend people do so if they're interested. And that's 10% to high impact causes. You can, change it up as you go along. Doesn't have to be one charity, but yeah, highly recommended. Oops, wrong
Yeah,
slide.
absolutely. Yeah, it's very much encouraged to be thinking each time you donate or each year or whatever about what organizations you currently think can most improve the lives of others. Um, and so they were thinking about setting that up, and I met with them, and it somehow never really occurred to me that you would be able to Google something like what charities are most effective.
Mm,
And it was so only talking to them that really brought home that that would be a possibility. And I'd kind of done bits and pieces of charity work, like volunteering for Oxfam and that kind of thing during my life, but never really gotten into any specific
mm,
thing. In large part, I think because it seemed so hard to know what I should do of the many different options. And so the idea that actually we could think rationally about this and compare different things and have some idea of which ones would be most important to go for was just very compelling to me.
mm,
And so I got involved initially in a research capacity, looking through, because it turned out there was a lot of data out there produced by places like the World Health Organization and the Disease Control Priorities Project, which basically produced these huge tables of data saying what kinds of interventions could help with what diseases, and how cost effective all of those were. But they weren't at all easy to read formats. They also didn't come with, and here are organizations you can give to which implement
Mm.
these. And so the early work that we were doing with Giving What We Can was looking through these giant tables, finding the things that seemed most cost effective, and then trying to find charities which actually implemented the most cost effective of these in the same kind of way as they'd been initially tested. So that was what really first drew me to it. I think I had come across Peter Singer during my school days and then during my philosophy degree, but kind of assumed that I never really would implement what he was
Mm.
saying and donate a significant portion of my income because no one around me did. So it seemed like, well, this does seem obviously right, but I guess it's just not something that people do.
Yeah.
Um, and then in hearing about this and getting involved in the research, it suddenly became the case that actually the people in my reference class did all give significantly. And in fact, Will and Toby made pledges to donate everything they earned above 20,000 rather than just
Mm.
10%. And so that also helped me feel more like this is the natural thing to do instead of being a huge sacrifice. And therefore, I ended up also taking the Giving What We Can pledge and felt extremely lucky to have found a reference class that was going to support me in carrying out what I actually thought was right in a way that I just wouldn't have had I been on my own. So that was my kind of first introduction to effective altruism.
So that actually resonates a bit with me. I Yeah, as Neon Golden says in chat, making a pledge publicly makes a big difference. Publicly pre-committing to ideas, I think, is a very useful way of kind of going through with them. Um, but yeah, personally, I have this distinct memory when I was about, I don't know, maybe 13 or so, 12, 13, somewhere around there. Um, I My parents had just bought a new car, or a second-hand car, but a moderately nice one, for I don't know, £3,000 or somewhere around there. And we were driving around it, and I said to my mum, "Mum, how much did this car cost?" She said, £3,000. So I think that one could probably save a. I probably didn't use one. I think you could probably save a life in somewhere in Africa for that kind of money, couldn't you? And she said, well, yeah, probably. I said, well, why don't we get the cheapest car we can, which is, £500 or something, and spend that money on saving a life? And she said, it doesn't work like that. That's not how things are done. I said, well, why not? And she says, no, it just doesn't work like that. And I don't want to like drag down my mum here. She's a very, lovely, sensitive, and intelligent person. Um, but there was just this kind of dismissal of, no, that's not the way things are done. And as you say, there seems to be this kind of norm in society that I don't want to even say making big sacrifices because driving a slightly less good car, that's not a huge sacrifice. Giving up the 10% of income that I have, I've never found that to be a big sacrifice. I'm still speaking to you on a really nice desktop computer. We've got tasty snacky food in the fridge, and we're not wanting for warmth or anything. And obviously it's not that everyone in the developed world is capable of giving a huge amount, but the vast majority of people uh, who do live in rich countries is able to give an amount that over the course of years can save many, many lives. And it's a powerful idea, I think, a powerful tool that we all have, well, not all of us, but most of us have uh, open to us. Um, so I'm interested in this uh, kind of after you first got involved with you met up with Will and Toby. Incidentally, I just move a couple of plates here. Toby Ord has recently published The Precipice, which I've shown several times on stream, but I will not stop showing because it's an extremely important book,
Great book.
and you should all read it. Um, Actually,
He reads it out himself on Audible.
he
I'm an
does.
Audible fan, and I really enjoy the way Toby tells things.
He's a surprise. If we ever solve existential risk and global poverty, Toby Ord would have a very solid backup career as an audiobook reader. um, I've now got it on audiobook, Kindle, and the hard copy, because audiobook is great for just like listening through, but you really need Kindle or a hard copy for referencing. And
Yeah, there are really interesting footnotes, and yeah, they're not even there on Audible.
yeah, the footnotes, so they go through. It's a uh, nearly 500-page book, 468, and the footnotes start at 243 for the like resources and footnotes and so forth. So about half the book is footnotes, and some of them are really excellent, and they're all very informative. Um, but but yeah, so once you'd going back to the kind of story, once you'd met up with these folks and the ideas had started to brew, what was the kind of how did you go from a bunch of philosophy students talking about and making a few individual pledges on how to do some good to a pretty substantial global movement that's moving around hundreds of millions of dollars?
It sounds pretty implausible, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Um, basically, so we had set up Giving What We Can as a student group, and had another couple of student chapters in other universities around the world. And a natural next step after thinking about pledging 10% of your income to the most effective charities was thinking about what your career was going to be and how you were going to maximize how much that 10% was. And then thinking about, okay, well, is it actually the most effective thing you can do to have a really lucrative career as opposed to, say, have a career in important research or something? And out of those kinds of considerations, a second organization was born, 80,000 Hours, which tries to figure out how you can do as much good as possible with the 80,000 hours that you have in your career. And both Giving What We Can and 80,000 Hours started doing fairly well in terms of attracting interest. And we realized we weren't going to be able to run them as volunteer organizations forever. So we decided to professionalize, figure out how you actually go about hiring people and things like that. And that was how we came to set up the Center for Effective Altruism, because we wanted it to be the case that we could employ the same staff for both organizations, and that they could really share resources and learn from each other. And at that point, we started thinking we basically needed to figure out how you hire people and how you pay salaries and things like that. And I had some small interest in finances from both my parents being accountants, so volunteered to be the person that did that kind of operational work. And it turns out I found it fascinating, learning how companies' house works and how you
Yeah.
become a charity and that kind of thing. But at that point, we were still thinking of effective altruism as just the part of the name of this organization, which was supposed to be an umbrella for 80,000 Hours and Giving What We Can that no one would have ever heard of. And the big thing really that happened was that Peter Singer gave a TED talk called Effective Altruism. And rather than going in with a very specific thought of how can you make the most of your career or which charities are the most effective, his Effective Altruism talk asked this broader question of how can we improve the lives of others as much as possible? And that ended up just really catching on. And that was how effective altruism as a concept ended up attracting much more attention than it had before. And that was in around March 2013, I think.
Yeah, I remember it must have been circa I think summer of 2011, probably Trinity term. Um, I went to a talk with the I was part of the Rationalist Society, which was kind of one of the early like feeders into the effective altruism movement, and the Oxford Rationalist Society. I don't think it's still going. It was just like weekly meetups of a bunch of sort of rational-minded people, and we went to the debate between Will and I think it was Nick Bedstead about Beckstead, sorry, about doing good now versus later. You know, should we save the third world or save the world, kind of thing. Um, which I think was one of the early like public discussions of the one of the big questions in effective altruism, which is sort of should we be focusing on making things better now or making things better in the future. Um, but yeah, I didn't realize it was that was before things had kind of gotten going. Because Peter Singer's a wonderful guy. Um, I remember debating him back in 2006 about the animal research thing, and and we had a very pleasant discussion. You know, he wasn't at all like the more strident animal rights activists.
Yeah, I'm almost surprised that you guys were on differing sides on
Hmm.
that.
Well, that's the thing. We kind of weren't after by the end of the debate. We we'd sort of come to an agreement, and Tipu, you know, Professor Aziz was involved as well. And well, you saw in the discussion back in 2006 how confident Professor Aziz is about his position. Um, but yeah, Tipu and Peter Singer came to a pretty reasonable agreement that you know, assuming the that Tipu's work on deep brain stimulation was using fewer primates than it was helping, and you know, we kind of went through what's actually involved in the research, and you know, it's used maybe the whole kind of field has used maybe 100 macaques worldwide over the last 10 years, and it's saved or treated people with Parkinson's X hundred, X tens of thousands over the last few years. And yeah, as I recall, there was pretty much consensus in the room that this was acceptable if it's done in a controlled and reasonable manner. And while we might disagree on other forms of experimentation, from a utilitarian perspective, it was pretty clear that this was a reasonable test. Um, and yeah, but going back to the kind of movement, sorry, I get distracted a lot with interesting tangents. But uh, so looking back on those kind of early days, where where you started off and then getting kicked off with Peter Singer really running with it. Are there any beliefs you had then that you don't have anymore that you were, say, confident about when you got started, but your experiences with effective altruism have changed?
I mean, uh, the one that feels most relevant is that it really, I remember starting the Center for Effective Altruism and thinking, well, we've got a couple of months in this because 9 out of 10 startups fail, and those are the ones that aren't run by philosophy students. um, so I think that, yeah, at the time I was nowhere near ambitious enough, probably in terms of what we might be able to accomplish in the world. But in terms of more useful things. I think one is that I was pretty interested in how much the general idea of effective altruism caught on. It kind of felt to me like, um, in one way, it's boringly obvious. It's just trying to be
Mm,
like, oh, we should be helping people and we should help them more, not less. Um, and that means there's not that much to kind of grasp onto by comparison to Giving What We Can, which had a lot of research
mm,
on what different kinds of interventions help people more and less, and had some kind of pretty interesting insights. So I just found it really crazy looking through the different cost effectiveness of different types of interventions, looking at, for example, Kaposi sarcoma, which is a late stage complication of AIDS, is pretty expensive to keep someone healthy from for a year, on the order of like tens of thousands of pounds, or at least was back
Yeah.
in the day when I knew these stats.
Yeah.
And that's well within the NHS's recommendation of this is a thing that we should fund, but is much more expensive than the, say, couple of £100 it costs to put someone on antiretrovirals and make sure that HIV doesn't turn into AIDS in the first place. And that's more expensive, again, than providing condoms for people, which is less cost effective, again, than mass media outreach warning people of the dangers, and maybe some targeted outreach to high risk groups like prostitutes.
And it's worth noting
Um,
there are many
and
orders of magnitude between the effectiveness of these interventions.
yes, I'm sorry, I no longer know the
No,
numbers on
that's
these.
okay. I'm trying to have a look around now, but
Great.
yeah, the key fact is there's a big difference. You know, tens of thousands of pounds versus like cents per treatment.
Yeah, and that just blew my mind, because it just does seem worth spending the tens of thousands of pounds the NHS will spend to keep people healthy here. But then there are also these treatments that people are foregoing, which are so much cheaper, and really, yeah, just brings home how many people we can help so cheaply. And that just felt so concrete that I was really expecting that to be something which was much more compelling to
Mm.
people than this far broader idea underlying it of effective altruism. But that turned out not really to be true. We thought that effective altruism would always be this kind of background thing that we didn't talk about directly. And in fact, that's turned out to be the broad movement. So I think that's something that I thought was very interesting, what people would find interesting to discuss and think about, and I guess what kind of messaging is most compelling, basically.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, sorry,
that's okay. Don't worry.
you can say something.
Um, yeah. So the converse of that. What beliefs have you had? Did you have at the start that have become even stronger, that have been very much reinforced?
Hmm. I guess one is my hopefulness about people. I strongly remember people telling us in the early days, you guys are doing this because you're only in your 20s and you won't stick with it, once you have families to look after. And people who are going into high paying careers, people who are going to work for an investment bank and are planning to give away a large amount of that,
Mm.
will find that it's just too hard to keep that up when you're surrounded by other people buying flashy cars and living in expensive places and things like that. And that just doesn't seem to have been the case. I mean, I'm definitely not saying that everyone has stuck with it, but people have stuck with it, I think, in a way more than I expected that they would. It's one thing to make a pledge to live on £20,000 for the rest of your life when you're a student, and it's quite another to hold to it 10 years later when you no longer are. And working in an investment bank in an expensive city and continuing to give away 50% of your income does seem like maybe it would be kind of tough. But yeah, I was chatting to someone the other day who had decided to do just that, and is now nearly 10 years later and says that actually he finds it easier than he was expecting to. I think partly that's because the community grew and held strong, and so people can support each other in doing this. But I think it also is just, yeah, sign about people actually genuinely wanting to help other people and being willing to live their life with that as one of their main drivers.
Yeah, and I think it's in many ways a very positive way to live one's life, thinking about how to achieve those kind of big goals, even if one's only doing it in little incremental ways. I personally find it very comforting thinking about where my donations are going, what kind of good they might be doing, and uh, even just in terms of kind of expected value, because there's a chance that any given pound I send to any cause will do nothing on the margin, but when taken in aggregate with other people's donations and with the rest of the community who we're working with to achieve this good, I can be confident that collectively we're doing a lot of good things and saving many lives, making a lot of people's lives better, and hopefully extending the range of future lives that will exist.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think that um, helping people in the future and ensuring that good lives exist is probably the part that I still struggle with the most. Early on in effective altruism, I was running Giving What We Can and was typically always talking about poverty and thinking about how we could um, ensure that more money went towards buying bed nets and deworming tablets. And that was very vivid and compelling in my mind. Whereas I actually think that we can help people most by um, working on longer term interventions, working out how we prevent the world from ending, whether from bioterrorism threat
Mm.
or from transformative AI. Um, and I think that people in the future, thousands or even millions of years from now, are really in the worst position to advocate for themselves. People the other side of the world aren't necessarily in a good way of in a good position to talk to us, and people in dire poverty certainly don't have much capacity to lobby. But people in the future have absolutely no way of getting to us. Um, but I find it harder to motivate myself to work on these longer term things when there are people right now dying for want of a simple bed net.
I know what you mean. I think there's a lot to be said for the there being no moral impact of geography to what we kind of should be doing. Uh, someone, at least ignoring like my family, someone I don't know who is suffering right outside my door has, other than perhaps the kind of ease with which I could help them, has no greater claim on help than someone suffering the other side of the world. Uh, but from a human perspective, if I can hear someone wailing outside my door in extreme pain, I'm probably going to want to treat them and help them out before someone the other side of the world. And extending your kind of your point there, someone who's a million years in the future or 1,000 years in the future, whatever, has even less voice to us. We can hear their screams even less obviously, and yet we have good reason to believe that they will exist, or will exist if we do things right. Um, but it's certainly a difficult leap to make. I still my primary charities of choice are mostly developing world ones, although my academic work is much more, my interest is much more in existential risk. Um, I think there's at least a nice psychological effect to knowing more concretely that X pounds is going to provide bed debts for people in this country, and having a definite kind of causal link there that one can point to. Um, but if we're relying primarily on that, then we're essentially just going back to the kind of feels over reals sort of thing of you know prioritizing the fluffiest cause that makes us feel the best rather than the one that we actually think is going to do the most good in the long term.
Yeah, and I think the problem is even worse maybe than you were stating it as, because there's something compelling about helping someone who's suffering, regardless of whether they're in the present or the future or here or the other side of the world. But in fact, the problem of existential risk isn't just one of helping people out of suffering,
Mm.
it's one of making sure that lives happen that might otherwise not. And I think that's hugely important. But I think it's even harder to really emotionally get behind
Yeah.
than simply making sure that future people don't suffer particular harms.
Yeah, absolutely. And it may well be the case that what we're working towards is not so much creating lives that wouldn't have existed in some form, but making mediocre or all right lives into far better ones, which I think is still
Mm-hmm.
extremely, extremely valuable. But there's perhaps less of an easy kind of intuitive link there, or intuitive leap there, when it comes to making people's lives far, far better, improving lives, as opposed to just removing suffering. Um, or rather giving pleasure as opposed to removing suffering. Um,
Yeah.
which of course kind of comes down to what one thinks. And this is something that particularly interests me about effective altruism, is that it's not only a powerful tool for getting people to do good and maximizing good, but it's quite an instructive lens to view one's own ethical systems through. Um, a lot of debates in effective altruism are kind of quite fundamentally decided on your ethical system, because when we're asking someone to do the most good, well, does that mean alleviating suffering? Does it mean improving lives? Does it mean making sure terrible lives don't exist? Does it mean making sure excellent lives do exist? And I think that that's where a lot of the disagreements in the community seem to come from, is these, rather than kind of stylistic differences or differences of empirical fact, tends to be more differences of value system.
I'm not sure if I agree with that.
No?
I think sometimes a bit too much is made of differences of value systems. So I think people typically see effective altruists as being fundamentally all utilitarians,
Mm,
um, which I think is false.
yeah.
I think effective altruism is fundamentally welfarist and concerned with consequences. But
Mm,
I think that most plausible ethical systems have a component which is you should increase well-being.
mm,
Um, Most deontological theories end up having
mm,
some, well, if the consequences are bad enough, you should still do that thing,
mm,
element to them. And then conversely, I think most effective altruists, in fact, have some deontological constraints on their views. So they don't think that you should, violate human rights and things like that. I think one way in which effective altruism is more plausibly like standard consequentialism and utilitarianism is that various deontological theories have kind of agent relative permissions that say, well, yeah, you could do this thing that maximizes well-being, but like you're just permitted to go about your life and ignore the people who are in dire straits or something. And I think typically effective altruism tries to rein that in some and say, well, you definitely have, it's definitely good for you to live a good life and a happy life, but maybe it's also good to think about these other people. And then I think, so there's a kind of set of theories in ethics called person affecting views, which there's a bunch of different versions of them, but maybe the most straightforward is that people, you should uh, make people happy, but you shouldn't make happy people,
Mm,
basically. So it says that it's actually not a bad thing if people don't come into existence because there's no one there to suffer. So why would that be bad? And I think there's sometimes a bunch made of people who care about alleviating current poverty, for example, or suffering in factory farms, rather than preventing existential risks, are doing it because they have person affecting views and
mm,
don't think that it particularly matters to help people in the future. Um, and my general perception is that that's basically not right, that the justifications typically given for working on poverty and animal rights are more often empirical ones. They're more often what seem to be pretty plausible claims along the lines of, well, but it's just really hard to know what's actually going to be successful. And I think this probably feels all the more compelling to quite a few people in effective altruism because they're often coming from maybe a traditional charity background where they feel that they did a bunch of work for some organization that they thought was doing a lot of good. And then
mm,
when they looked into it much more, it just wasn't clear that that intervention really worked, or it wasn't clear that the organization was really implementing the intervention that well and that kind of thing. And so they tend to have this quite high bar for will something actually work and think, well, if we're talking about 100 years out, given that
yeah.
it's hard to figure out if this intervention works in 6 months' time in, the country
In
that
the
I'm
next
living
country
in,
over or something, yeah.
right, why would I think that I could affect anything at all that happens in the next 1,000 years? Yeah, so I think for that reason, maybe more of the differences within effective altruism are based on empirical thinking
Okay.
rather than differences in ethical views.
Okay, I take your point. I think that's a reasonable one, and also I think you're more in deep with the community than I am, so you would know better on that matter. Um, but I think that all of this. I mean, we've been talking for over an hour now, and we're no closer to solving the kind of fundamental problems of or challenges rather than problems of effective altruism. Um, and yet the broader media cycle is very fast, and we see a lot of demand for very short form, easily digestible content that one can scroll down in newsfeed and watch for a couple of minutes and then scroll on to the next thing. Um, how best do you think effective altruists, both the kind of organisations involved and individual members, can uh, get their message across in this kind of social media environment?
Yeah, I think this is a real challenge. And this is also something where I guess my views have changed some since the start, where kind of early on, we were basically just trying to get these ideas to as many people as possible, trying to be in mass media types of outlets and get as many people as possible to do some concrete, meaningful action. Um, Whereas over the last 5 years or something, effective altruism has been much more trending towards trying to keep the ideas with all their nuance and spread them more slowly in a way that gets people to really fully understand
Mm,
everything that's going on. Um, I don't think it's totally clear which of those is actually the better approach, but I definitely think that it's very easy for the former approach to go wrong in a bunch of different ways. So, for example, one way that it went wrong was that uh, people ended up equating effective altruism with the randomistas, the people who are really into randomized control trials. And I
right.
think
Yeah.
that's very reasonable in the sense that effective altruists tend to be extremely in favor of randomized control trials because they're an excellent way of learning more about interventions which seem superficially plausible but maybe actually aren't that good. But it also means that people assume that effective altruists don't care about systemic change and don't care about things that are more speculative,
Mm.
which I think is totally false, as we've been discussing a bunch on existential risk. It doesn't get that much more speculative
Yeah.
than how do we make the next million years go well. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there's been kind of media things that talk about like, oh, these people care about killer robots or something because someone was writing a paper on transformative AI and then gets translated into the Terminator, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so you both end up getting seen as like, oh, the people that only care about RCTs, oh, and the people that care about killer robots.
Mm.
And in that sense, things that are more like long form podcasts and writing books tend to work somewhat better. You know, find the people who actually are willing to sit down and listen to 2 hours of some
Mm.
idea or read a whole book and then are enthusiastic to get involved rather than reading a couple of paragraphs, taking away a slightly wrong message and being like, oh, I disagree with those guys because I think that the world is more nuanced than that. Which I guess slightly points towards ignore this whole social media bite-sized type of thing, which seems not likely to be actually the right answer.
Mm.
I guess one of the reasons that I'm here is that I think that these kinds of long form discussions feel like exactly the kind of thing that it would be good to have more of, so that people can really go in depth into different ideas and things rather than trying to share the much shorter things. And I guess, yeah, the same with kind of online forums. One thing that I am hoping maybe comes out of everyone being stuck indoors is that maybe people get a chance to kind of write up the interesting speculative ideas that they hadn't had a chance to before and have a bit more time for reading other people's speculative ideas and arguing with them and trying to really come to new understandings of what the best ways of improving the world are.
Absolutely. And I would certainly hope some serious work on X-Risk gets done by the community over the next couple of years, particularly with the release of Toby's book, because that is very well timed with the current global crisis. Um,
Yes, yeah.
yeah,
It'd be interesting to see how much global catastrophic biological risks end up getting more attention than they
mm,
previously did. Because, yeah, you can imagine that this really allows governments and other bodies the cover to pour money into how to do like into the best ways of preparing for the next pandemic, whatever form it takes. But
yeah,
you can also kind of imagine that, you know, my understanding is that money that was put into how to prevent the next Ebola crisis ended up getting siphoned off because 6 months later people had moved on to the next fire.
yeah.
So yeah, I don't know how realistic it is to think that this will be an impetus to change things even for the next 5 years, let alone for the next 100 years.
Yeah, I would certainly hope it does provide some real incentive, and that's certainly what I'm going to. So I'm appearing on Destiny's stream on Friday. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's a
No, I don't think so.
fairly notable like Twitch streamer. Does lots
Mm-hmm.
of gaming, but also does lots of like political content,
Mm-hmm.
and he's got an audience regularly in the like tens to hundreds of thousands sort of views. But yeah, so I'm going to be making the case for existential risk research to him
Mm-hmm.
and focusing
Mm-hmm.
particularly on global biological catastrophic risks
Mm-hmm.
and engineered pandemics, that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
because partially because it takes a lot longer to unpack AI and explain exactly
Yeah.
why that's so scary and why it's not, it's not alarmist and so forth. Um, but also because, pandemic risk is so hot right now, and
Mhm.
it should be
Mhm.
an easy kind of framework to hang it on,
Mhm.
or hook to hang it on.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I think now is potentially a very good opportunity to start. It's temporary time where ameliorating biorisk might be more tractable than normal, and I
Mhm.
think we need to take advantage of it.
Yeah, and really lock in the changes that we want to see in
Exactly,
government and
yeah,
intergovernmental organizations.
absolutely. Um, so yeah, just as a kind of, I don't want to keep you too long, but if you're all right with another question.
Mhm.
Um, so this is it's potentially quite a big one, but in terms of kind of focusing on public messaging as opposed to the sort of academic side of things, um, what kinds of EA activism or content or uh, organizations do you think are most neglected? What areas of value might we still be able to capture?
It is quite a broad-ranging question, isn't it?
Indeed.
Um,
Feel free to kind of attack whatever area of it you would like.
Thanks. Yeah. Um, I guess, yeah, there's a few different types of things that I'm enthusiastic to see at the moment. I guess, so one thing is that it feels like there's been quite a lot of emphasis in the past on um, kind of small groups that are explicitly effective altruist or
Mm,
something, as opposed to um, working within existing structures. Um, I think that's partly by virtue of being a youngish movement. There was quite a lot of links to Silicon Valley and um, setting up startups, quite a bit of frustration early on with, charities not doing things quite as well as they could have done and, trying to do things again. Um, but I feel like uh, as we kind of age as a movement and are finding that generally we should be becoming more ambitious, it becomes more plausible that we should be thinking about how we really change large institutions. So, one of the things that I worked on in the past was setting up the Global Priorities Institute, which is
mm,
an organization, part of Oxford University, which does philosophy and economics research and has the very explicit mission of figuring out what the most impactful research is in philosophy and economics, doing useful research there in order to interest other academics in also working on those questions, and thereby influencing academia in
mm,
general in more impactful directions. And I think we're starting to see good work being done in terms of effective altruist thinking through how to work within large governments as well. There's actually an organization called HYPE, which has been set up to think about how um, civil servants in the UK can use their careers as impactfully as possible, which is
excellent.
pretty exciting. Um, and yeah, hopefully we'll see more of this kind of thing in the future. Um, I think it can seem more frustrating for the kinds of people who want to get things done in the world and see results of their helping quickly to work within large bureaucracies. And as someone who's worked within the University of Oxford, I absolutely sympathize with that. Um, but it is going to be hugely important. And then linked to this is um, exploring different avenues for doing good. I think we kind of started off by kind of picking the low hanging fruit in terms
Mm,
of thinking of, what are the obvious things that really need doing soon. Um, but that there are just a huge number of things that we don't understand well enough to know how they're going to be helpful. So, you know, one just like very specific example would be the how anthropology was helpful in reducing the spread of Ebola in
mm,
2014, where burial practices were increasing the spread, and it was difficult to prevent people from touching their dead because it seemed so disrespectful to them,
yeah.
and you needed to just thoroughly understand the culture in order to understand how to navigate that and help people to be safe, but also be respectful of their dead. Um, and that's the kind of thing that just wouldn't be at all obvious, right? So I
Yeah.
think we're getting to a point where I'm really enthusiastic about people trying out lots of different avenues and seeing what what comes of it. But that is kind of difficult to do as an individual because, first of all, you have to have good judgment to figure out how to get towards what's most valuable in this new field. And then also you're taking on this risk of, well, maybe I'll just go down a bunch of dead ends and won't end up having that much impact in
Mm,
my career. Whereas if I say work for the Gates Foundation or something, I'm just absolutely robustly going to do a bunch of
yeah.
good in my life.
Yeah, and that's always it. I mean, it feels like a big gamble because it is if you're going into a field where you might do a lot of good but might achieve almost nothing. I guess it's kind of difficult to psychologically prepare oneself for, but it's also something that we need a lot of people doing if we're to achieve a lot of the as yet unidentified, big sources of value. Chat says that sounds
Yeah.
like academia, haha. Yeah, fair. That does sound a lot like academia in general.
Yeah, I think for these kinds of things, it's fairly important for people to understand their own motivations and what kind of things they're well suited for
Mm,
in quite a bit of detail. Um, so I tend to be very motivated by the people around me and, making my manager happy and not letting down my team and that kind of thing.
mm,
And that ends up meaning that so I'd mentioned that before I worked a lot on preventing global poverty, and now I mostly work on more long-termist things, which is what my values say I should be doing,
mm.
but is emotionally more challenging. But that doesn't actually matter to me on a day-to-day basis because on a day-to-day basis, I'm just trying hard to make sure that I don't let down my team and things like that. And I think it's pretty useful for people to try and get a good understanding of um, how they function and what's actually going to be sustainable for them in the long run and how they might be able to kind of hack their motivational system to allow them to work on, a thing that's high risk, high reward without finding that too off putting or whatever. And I don't think this is in any way easy. I personally was very surprised when I switched from my last job to this job. Um, just how much more fun I found this one. So right now I'm doing advising for people on how they might be able to help people more with their career as part of 80,000 hours. And I'd been aware of this kind of role for many years, but always assumed that I wouldn't really like it because
Mm.
I'm kind of shy and think of myself as introverted and not that good at talking to people. And so the idea of having this job where I just talk to people all day seemed obviously bad. And then it just turns out that the thing I don't like is going into a room with lots of people and having unstructured conversations. And as long as it's one person at a time with an agenda, I love it. Um, so I think it's really worth trying out a bunch of different things and seeing what actually works well for you.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with an agenda.
I have. I was even sent the agenda beforehand. It's ideal.
Um, just before we go, we've got another message from chat. I see a ton of parallels between the EA movement and the open science movement and ways they complement each other, e.g., doing science better, making sure that we can trust in our evidence, etc. Um, I think that's a really good point, and I intend to have some people on from the open science movement, and actually I know quite a lot of people in both. Maybe we can set up some communication lines there, because I know a lot of the people who are more focused on that area are very interested in how to do good, and I'm not sure if they've been, or not sure if all of them have been exposed to applying that principle to kind of philosophy and policy. So yeah, I think
Yeah, that
that's
sounds great. I feel like how to improve science is a really important topic and one that
mm,
I feel like I don't know nearly enough about. I kind of have some ideas of things that people are trying, but not the what the overall space looks like or whatever. And yeah, as you say, super important.
yeah. Well, I'll see if I can start some conversations going and yeah. Um, well, Dr. Michelle Hutchinson, thank you very much indeed for coming on. I really appreciate your giving us the time. And before you go, is there anything you'd like to plug? Any like specific projects or anything?
No, you've already, yeah, I think I would have mentioned the Precipice since it just came out and is such a great book and introduction to such important things. But it sounds like you've been doing a good job plugging it already.
Oh yes, very much so. Um, yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. There's just that occasional book that I read, once every 5 years or so that makes me go, oh wow, this brings together a lot of ideas I've had, but then expands on them and goes into far more depth. And yeah, it's a real kind of crystallization of a lot of absolutely vital ideas.
Yeah, there's another book coming out, but not for a while. Will McCaskill's writing a book on long termism.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, I'm really looking forward to that coming out, but I think it'll be another year or something.
Yeah, and of course, friend of the show, Anders Sandberg has a book in the works that's been in the works for a while, but I'll plug that properly when it's close to coming out. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, have you talked much about Human Compatible? I don't know how you found that book.
I haven't talked about it in huge depth. I did briefly chat about it with Stuart Armstrong on stream the other day.
Hmm.
But yeah, I found it very enjoyable, remarkably readable. Um, and I don't really know enough about the kind of fundamentals of machine learning to critique that side of things. I thought it was uh, I'm not certain whether I thought maybe some of the techniques he's proposing to kind of combat AI risk were perhaps stated a little bit confidently, but
Hmm.
on the other hand, he is trying to Stuart Russell is trying to present a relatively positive, upbeat. It's scary, but here's what we can do about it. So maybe
Yep.
that's appropriate.
Yeah, I quite like that it gave a kind of broad-ish overview of the
Mm,
different risks and things that you might do about them compared to superintelligence, which was um, excellent but very
yeah,
detailed and harder to get into and less broad.
yeah.
Actually, maybe one thing that I should suggest people check out is so I work for 80,000 hours, and we have a podcast run
Mm.
by our head of research, Rob Wiblin,
Oh God,
which I
yes.
really enjoy. It's,
Mm,
yeah, I think its tagline is something like surprisingly in depth
mm, mm.
conversations with people about how you can help the world using your career. And so they are, in fact, as promised, all about 2 hours or longer. But he manages to get some really interesting guests. So the most recent, I think, was Mark Lipsitch from Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security talking about how we're doing in the fight against COVID. It was really good.
Oh, there's also Danny Hernandez on forecasting and measuring some of the most important drivers of AI progress.
Oh yeah, that one was a good one too.
And there's you back on episode 75
Yes.
on what people most often ask 30,000 hours. So yeah, I can. I can personally attest as well. The I haven't listened to the last couple, but I generally catch up with on them once every couple of months, and yeah, they're very good. And as Michelle says, just go very in depth, much more than you'd expect from a regular podcast, even more so than Lawfare or something, which is also very good. But they give the expert a lot of time to really dive deep and explain their ideas. And also, Rob's a very good interviewer. Um, so
Yeah, one thing I like is he tries hard to ask some questions that they won't have been asked too many times before.
I very
So
much
he's actually
appreciate that.
had the odd one where he only had kind of an hour with the person.
Mm,
And so what they did then was put one of the person's intro lectures at the start so that he could still ask a bunch of questions that they, wouldn't usually
that's
be
a good
asked.
idea. Yeah, I like that very much. Um,
Hmm.
I'm trying to do a little bit of that kind of thing on this channel, not quite to the same depth, make it like a little bit more accessible, maybe. Not that it's not the 80,000 hours isn't accessible, but it is. It's definitely a commitment. Um, but yeah, and I hope that some of my questions today are ones that you haven't had all the time.
Yes, for sure.
And yeah, so thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate your coming on. And
Great to chat to you. Thanks. I
yeah,
enjoyed it.
yeah, you too. And if you want to pop on again sometime, if you've got any burning things you want to shout about, I'm always happy to promote the effective altruist movement. So please do.
Awesome.
Right, well, have a good evening. Happy
You too.
Wednesday, and I'll see you later. Bye.
Yeah. Good night.